Advisor, Government of India, V. Anantha Nageswaran. The economy has shown some signs of recovery as India emerges out of the COVID-19 pandemic, but the country faces multiple challenges including high prices and high current account deficit. One of the best placed minds to reflect on the immediate and medium-term challenges facing the economy, Nageswaran will take us through the trade-offs in exercising various options. Express Adda, presented by Royal Ranthambore, co-presented by UP in association with Devans and hospitality partner Le Meridian.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Pooja Pillai. I am here on behalf of the Indian Express to welcome you to the latest edition of Adda, a series of informal interactions with news and opinion makers organized by the Indian Express. Our guest today is the Chief Economic Advisor, V. Anantha Nageswaran. There couldn't be a better time to have him here with us because as the economy is emerging from the grip of COVID-19, there are several challenges that lie ahead, and not the least of which is inflation, and he is exactly the right person to talk about this with us. He will be in conversation this evening with Anand Goenka, Executive Director, Indian Express, and P. Vaidyanathan Iyer, Executive Editor, Indian Express. Before I pass this on, I would also like to thank our partners. The Express Adda is presented by Royal Ranthambore and co-presented by UP SIDA. Our associate partner, Devans, and our hospitality partner, of course, is Le Meridian. I will now pass this on to Anant and Vedi.
I'm trying to notice that Dr. Nageswaran's got a file with sort of post-its on it, so I think we're in for a good treat. You know, I think there couldn't have been a newsier person to get for Adda today, and I'll just say why. Now, you know, Vaidi and Dr. Nageswaran here are the economists who will talk a language that I might struggle to understand. So I'll just pose a few layman questions, or rather just read out some of the layman news that, as a layman I felt is a great reason to have you here. First is that the World Trade Organization says that global trade will keep dropping. The other is that World Bank says that India will grow only at 6.5%. That came out, I think, last night. The RSS says that unemployment and inequality of income is a problem in India. That happened last week. OPEC, for some reason, thinks that the world can afford more expensive energy, so they are now controlling output. They're controlling the output of oil. And Ukraine has won back some of its lost ground, which is obviously a great achievement for the underdog. And you know, it's wonderful to watch and see this sort of fight back. But also, this just means that the war is going to go on for a really, really long time. That's quite clear after the development of the last few weeks. So all these headlines have tremendous economic impacts. You're the right person to declutter it all for us and to explain it to us. The CEA has been that one institution which kind of brings the academic rigor to policy making that we all kind of look for. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being here at the Express Adda. And isn't this an extremely complicated, am I right in saying this is an extremely complicated time that we're living in economically?
First of all, thank you for having me here. It is not a very difficult thing to agree with you that it is indeed a complicated situation that we are facing because 2022, we all thought finally we would put the pandemic behind us and look forward to a year of recovery and growth. And within a month of India heaving a sigh of relief after the Omicron wave came and went relatively in a muted manner. Then we had the budget, but then within a few weeks, the conflict in Europe erupted, which in turn led to a breakout of commodity prices, at least in the first quarter of our financial year. And then that in turn has led to synchronized interest rate increases by central banks around the world, including in India. And just as we thought there are some benefits, quote unquote, benefits under quotes, to the economic slowdown, such as lower commodity prices that come in their wake, then we have had the production cut by OPEC. And there are still further lingering uncertainties as to, you kind of alluded to that, as to depending on which way the conflict goes, there could be potential for extreme reactions from some sides, and then what would happen to the oil prices themselves, whether the intended oil price cap works out the way it is intended or goes in a different direction. So it's a fairly complex situation. But I think, again, I'm speaking in relative terms. Under the circumstances, I think India enjoys relative macroeconomic stability and also prospect for growth, not just in the current financial year, but subsequent years as well, which I think is something, given the headwinds that we face and which might linger, I think is something that should make us feel relatively comfortable. Yes, we should be in a world without some of these headwinds, we should be able to grow much faster. But I think under circumstances, the kind of growth projections that we are seeing, whether it is 6.5 or 7 or whatever, I think we should be somewhat relieved that if these growth outcomes do materialize under the situation that we find ourselves in, it would be a creditable achievement.
I think, the inflation and growth paradox in that equation, I think we can talk about for hours, and I know a lot of them spoken about, and we will. I think the one headline that I didn't mention, which I think is confusing me the most, as a layman, is, rupee all-time low, 82. Today touch 82 rupees and change. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's neither. It's a reality. It's neither a good thing nor a bad thing. And first of all, we are talking about a bilateral exchange rate of just one pair. And if you look at the rupee's performance in the course of the current financial year or current calendar year, it is one of the better ones. And I'm not just speaking about the emerging economies, including advanced currencies such as the euro, the pound, the yen, and the Korean won, etc. I think rupee has done far better against the US dollar. And naturally, given that other countries that I mentioned have depreciated or weakened against the dollar even more than the rupee has, which means against these currencies, Indian rupee has done much better. So there it is not at a historical low. I mean, it's probably it is stronger than what it was a year or two ago. So I think we need to sort of keep these kind of headlines in perspective. So I wouldn't be worried about this is neither good or bad, because the reality is when the United States raises interest rates and when investors around the world become cautious and when flows of capital get affected, dollar tends to appreciate against all comers. And that is the way to look at it. This year, since the conflict broke out, it's a story of dollar strength. It's not a story of rupee weakness.
No, so in that, I mean, is there a concern then, I mean, do you share the concern that we're not weakened enough, that we're becoming uncompetitive because we've appreciated relative to euro, pound, yuan?
No, these conclusions, these discussions will always be inconclusive. I mean, there are arguments to make on both sides, and the proof of the pudding will have to be in the eating in terms of empirically whether it benefits. So you have to get down to the granulars, and I think we don't want to put our guests to sleep before they have had the dinner. So it's whether the rupee weakness would help exports in an environment when there is so much of uncertainty and growth is slowing down in many countries, though, does it really help to have a weaker currency? Because After all, if I have to sell you something, you must have income in your wallet, and I must give a price that you find attractive. The currency weakness will only make the price attractive. But if your income is not there, you're not going to buy from me no matter how much discount I offer. But in the process, a weaker currency, if it makes my indispensable imports more expensive, then what have I achieved in the process? So that is why I said these are all slightly more involved discussions. And I feel at the moment, the path of gradual currency adjustment to the reality of higher interest rates in the US and risk aversion, what is going on is something that is par for the course.
And expected.
Continue. And expected, and is something that we can live with. Yeah.
Anantha, I know I'm just wondering whether I should ask questions which will put people to sleep, but I can't resist myself from asking a few. Inflation, persistent inflation has eaten into savings of the common man. And now we are seeing last 5 months interest rates have risen continuously, which is also probably people will spend less because they are maybe paying more EMIs, etc. So do you see these two in effects actually hurting you both in terms of suppressing demand and also reducing expenditures by people?
Look, I mean, theoretically, obviously, the answer would be yes to your question, that if an inflation raises, obviously, everything else being equal, it does eat into the purchasing power. But you mentioned about rising interest rates leading to lower spending, but rising interest rates also raises income for savers and depositors. And until the interest rates went up, we were complaining about the fact that real rates of return for savers were negative. Now real rates of return on deposits will be increasing. So that is something to keep in mind. And this inflation is something that, in relative terms, is hurting almost all countries around the world, and it is coming out of factors beyond our control. Yes, at the margin, it is going to hurt, and that is why our growth forecasts, which were at 9% or so at the beginning of the year, have come down to 6.5%, and that's a reflection of the fact that it is hurting.
Yeah. So this on growth, you said that World Bank has said 6.5%. RBI did talk about a 7% growth rate. Looking at it, the way you are involved in discussions on budget estimates might start next week. Looking at the macro economy, what are the things that you look at, 4 or 5 aspects like inflation, the fiscal deficit, growth? How do you look at what kind of the best case scenario?
The best case scenario, given the state of the world, would be for India to be able to achieve a real growth rate which has a 7 handle in front of it. Okay, that would be a good situation. But if I look at some of the so-called high-frequency indicators, like footfalls in restaurants, air travel, railway freight moved, etc. Since we have data up to August more clearly, some of those indicators have held up far better than expected. 1 or 2 areas which were lagging behind, such as contact services, hotels, restaurants, etc., even they have improved, although they are not gone back to the pre-pandemic levels. So only 2 aspects of the various high-frequency indicators we track, only 2 of them are still below the pre-pandemic levels, such as international tourist arrivals and domestic travel. But everything else has gone past the pre-pandemic level. So in that sense, since the new financial year started in April until the first 5 months of data, in spite of the increase in oil price, etc., the recovery has remained relatively resilient to the situation. And that's a heartening situation that shows that some of the underlying strengths are beginning to come back since the pandemic has receded.
Yeah.
So we are seeing a lot of credit offtake in the retail side, and that's, I guess, so I think from the Indian perspective, this idea of consumer is solid, and consumer is the place that we are, I guess, differentiating from the rest of the world, and that's what we're kind of banking on. Is that fair to say?
Is it fair to say that?
Is that fair to say that this retail side, the consumer side, that is what's actually keeping us, that's what's making us sort of differentiate from the rest of the world by being the solid economy?
As a large country with a large domestic population and consumer base, yes, India has, compared to East Asian countries, domestic consumption has been an important component of economic growth. Yes, so on average, that's a correct statement to say. Yeah.
And do you see that? I mean, are you concerned about that, the main engine of our growth that we're seeing and how we're different from the rest of the world? Are you concerned about that slowing down at some point?
No, if anything, that had slowed down during the pandemic years,
Yeah,
and therefore
post-pandemic, I'm saying.
Post-pandemic years, the recovery is beginning to happen. And if you look at the surveys that the RBI puts out before every monetary policy meeting, and if you have been tracking that over the course of 2021 and 2022, the direction of change has been in the positive direction. The consumers are not becoming more pessimistic, they are becoming less pessimistic about their income prospects, about their employment prospects, about their spending intentions on durables or big ticket items. So it is not as if they are becoming more concerned and withdrawing. Instead, I see an improvement, and that is that's a survey that the RBI does in several, both not just large cities but also mid-tier cities, etc. And it's a fairly large sample, and that is moving in the right direction.
I guess my question is, do you see that lasting through all this uncertainty? Or when, because we are seeing corporates being careful because of uncertainty, but consumers in India don't seem to be, they are seeming to be very bullish. I mean, Diwali is, every festival you see everything retail doing really well.
No, corporates are being careful compared to what we expected them to, but not careful compared to the kind of spending we have had in the previous 2 years. So that is in the right direction. Compared to what we would have expected, in the absence of the conflict in Europe, in the absence of the rise in commodity prices, it would have been much better. That's why I said our growth forecasts have come down by international agencies or by RBA from 9.5 to 6.5. So in comparison to what we expected, yes, there is a certain pullback. The reality is shaping up to be lower than what we expected. But
from corporates?
From corporates, and also that's reflected in the overall GDP growth as well. But in terms of the momentum is still positive. It could have been even better.
Of course. Yeah.
That I agree.
Anand, one, in your book, Can India Grow? There's something which you mentioned in your book about the future growth potential of India critically depends on expanding the missing middle, where you talk about the medium-sized producers and the middle-class consumers. So I just wanted to understand a couple of things which have happened. Does it actually, say for instance, a GST which is not the best GST? Many say that it is a flawed GST as on date. I'm sure that there can be improvements, or some other radical policy decisions like a demonetization or a very hard lockdown, which we had. Do you see these things as making it difficult for for the ability to expand the middle?
No, I don't think I fully understand the question. First of all,
in the sense that, say when a GST as well as demonetization did, anecdotally when our reporters went around the country, there were huge instances of demand destruction and, small and micro enterprises kind of even shutting down, not being able to, reopen.
No, I think, first of all, that happened about 6 years ago, and it would have had a short-term impact, but you don't see that in the aggregate data, where it is not as though enterprises remain shut, because enterprises do form, enterprises do fade, and whatever happened beyond the initial 2 to 3 quarters, given the fact that there were simultaneously other things happening in the economy, such as a financial system in distress, so you cannot attribute everything to that one single event whose shock probably lasted a quarter or two. And you spoke about the GST that is flawed, maybe, but I think we are not talking about the reality in comparison to an ideal, but the reality in comparison to what preceded that. if in comparison to what we are having now was a plethora of 480 odd tax rates and you have 40 odd tax rates, it might look unappealing to you against your ideal of having a 3 or 4 or maybe 2 rates. But the fact is we have come down from 480 to 40, and it is a work in progress in many ways, and government has been responsive to making those changes. So I think we need to appreciate the fact that incrementally the systems and the policies are moving in the right direction. So in terms of evaluating how an economy is doing, I don't think things have become more difficult. Things have become less difficult. Now, as far as the missing middle is concerned, again, that's a work in progress. I think these things take much longer time to play out. But again, the same GST that you commented about is actually helping in the formalization of the economy in terms of many small businesses which would in the past have found it convenient to stay under the radar, are now saying the benefits of being able to come into the formal system so that they could get the input tax credits and they could get access to credit, etc. So I do see, for example, in the data on the number of businesses that a platform like Flipkart or Amazon, how much they onboard, and Paytm, the number of MSME enterprises that they extend credit or financial. I see the numbers are really picking up very, very rapidly in terms of the small and medium enterprise, micro and small enterprises that they're onboarding. So the process of filling the missing middle in India, I think, is unfolding. And therefore, I would even say that what we wrote 6 years ago, some of the developments that have happened, such as the digital infrastructure and the evolution of GST, have aided that process rather than impeded them.
Okay. The other thing I wanted to check, how worried or how concerned are you about, say, the rural economy? Because from some data that we pick up about on NREGA, the NREG numbers for the first 6 months this year are still higher than, it's about at 4.4 crore households, almost like 70% of what it was even in the pre-pandemic year. Pre-pandemic year, the full year's NREGA numbers were about 5.4, 5.5 crores. So people are still looking for NREGA jobs and in large numbers. Second, also, as far as, say, FMCG spends in rural areas are concerned, it doesn't give us a sense of that they have picked up dramatically, and rural areas do contribute 2/3 of the total FMCG spend. Does that concern you?
No, I think, well, I'll give you the data that we look at. Yes, you are right. Maybe the NREGA total number of beneficiaries could be 4.4 crores that you mentioned. But we also looked at the breakdown. Lately, what we are seeing in the last several years is NREGA claims for households improving their own land holdings. That has gone up from a very small portion of the overall NREGA payments to nearly 1/3. Which means people are using this also not just as an unemployment dole, but also as a means of improving their asset base. So therefore, I might even consider that as not as an unemployment subsidy, but more as a capital formation subsidy. So that is both the number of claims as well as the value of the claims related to own land improvement has picked up tremendously in the last 8 years.
Yeah.
So you need to look at the granular data. And also on the FMCG, yes, some, I see in recent data, the two-wheeler and the four-wheeler sales are beginning to pick up, and tractor sales have done well, and they have retrenched maybe in the last 1 or 2 months, but they had a great comeback in 21, 22, etc. So I think some of the improvements will relatively be slow because people will adjust depending on the evolution of energy prices or input costs, etc. And as I said, one can always say a 9% GDP growth is better than 6.5% or 7% GDP growth. But considering, again, as we talked earlier, considering the configuration of the situations we are facing, I think we have to accept that some progress will be uneven, some will be slower than what we expect, but it is moving northwards and not southwards.
I'm seeing Sanjeev Mehta in the first row. I'm tempted. Would you like to make a comment on this, or should I'm breaking format? But since you're right here,
no, I can give a
Get a mic for Mehta, please. Sorry.
I can give a perspective on FMCG consumption. First is, if you look at it at a national level, our per capita consumption is about $45. And it's significantly less still, even when compared to developing nations. Yeah, Indonesia is 2x, China is 3x, Philippines is 4x, the per capita. Now within this, rural is 1/3 of urban. And right now what we are seeing is, headline growth is there. It is in mid-single digits. But the volume growth is negative mid-single digits. Yeah, so we are talking about that the price increase, which is about 10–12%, that is taking a toll on consumption. But when it takes a toll on consumption from a very small base, it does impact that people are daily essentials also, they're cutting back on volume. That's the picture as far as rural is concerned. In fact, this is average, rural is a bit worse when you look at volumes.
Thank you, thanks. No, you know, we can kind of think about what are the, there's just so many things which are not in our control, which is causing all the uncertainty in the place we're in. What is in our control that you think we can be more efficient with? Broad question, but are there more things that we can do that we can, that you think we can be more, just help ourselves, whatever is in our control?
I mean, as you said, that's a too broad a question. So we as
privatization.
Sorry?
Privatization, reform, labor reform, bankruptcy code reform. Are these issues that you think that you would put forth, that you think that we can help sort of?
Yeah, I think some of these things that you mentioned as an example have indeed been happening, and whenever there is a feedback or an experience that necessitates a need for certain tweaks, these tweaks have happened either in IBC or for that matter in GST. And yes, we can always continue to work on making many of our processes simpler and one-stop or single window clearances, and also especially for micro and small and medium enterprises, because their bandwidth, both financially and in terms of human resources, is relatively very restricted. So the amount of compliance burden that they face, and I'm not talking about the union government alone, but also even local governments, etc. And to the extent we reduce their compliance burden, then we will definitely relieve the constraints that they face, both in terms of financial and human resources. So those are all ongoing developments that we could do. And that is what would sort of unleash the entrepreneurial. And mind you, in the last 2 years, despite the pandemic, the government has indeed sort of announced a roadmap for privatization. And there again, I would say the issue is not just with the government's intent or even the energy it puts into privatization, which I can tell you is undiminished. But we should also remember that there are so many stakeholders who feel that they would lose out in the privatization process. And given the systems we have, they find many ways to create hurdles in the process, and to overcome them all and to be able to privatize, it is a lot of, it's a very labor-intensive process. So we should also understand that for whatever we expect the government to be doing, as your question alluded to, I would also throw the ball back in the court of the rest of the society. So when we talk of national objectives, it is not just the responsibility of the governments or the state actors alone to do, but we should also have to look at whether we are also acting in the collective interest or in terms of narrow interests.
Can you elaborate a little bit where you think society can sort of encourage? I mean, let's take bank privatization for instance.
Sorry?
Let's take bank privatization for instance.
Right.
Where do you think we can play a role to, what are the obstacles you think?
No, for example, I think I must say back in 2007 or 8, I think your newspaper did a wonderful job of showing that some of the enterprises privatized in 2002, 3, 4, how well they were doing in terms of creating employment or expanding business, etc. So we need to show some of those case studies that it is important that the pie grows larger, and even if our share of the pie comes down, but because the pie itself has become bigger in absolute terms, we all benefit. So the discourse has to be more in terms of putting the long term ahead of the short run considerations, and that is where the discourse also can help. That's one way of showing how I think we should be able to see that it is not a win-lose situation, it can be a win-win situation, and that's just one illustration here.
No, Anant, very, very interesting point. In fact, we did the series, I remember, but those are certain things which have happened over the last, a year or so, which kind of makes us wonder whether everything that is happening is indeed giving encouragement for the bureaucracy to work aggressively towards some of these things, say privatization. Say one or two couple of privatization measures went to the courts, and the minister of the era then had to go to the courts, has to go to the courts. Or say, for instance, a secretary gets imprisoned, said to be one of the best. Or say, increasingly, I as a reporter, when I am talking to several people in Delhi and Bombay, I get a sense of this overbearing agencies presence, or say the fear of agencies. So some of these issues, while we are talking about, say, reforms, they are also creating some kind of a, what shall I say, it is deterring many to take that leap forward. Okay, so though I'm saying, is that something which the government is cognizant of? Because I don't find the government responding to this, or the government addressing these issues.
No, I think, again, if I say the government is cognizant of these issues, you're not going to be satisfied with the answer. So, because I won't be able to give you details of, demonstrate the extent of cognizance that is there. But I would also like to throw one more issue on the floor here. Sometimes what even people outside the government champion as contributions to better governance, such as the so-called right to information, which I also personally think is in principle a great thing, can sometimes stymie the decision-making and discussions, and therefore it is not just the government. Even people outside who have public interest at heart must remember two things. There is always the law of unintended consequences and the road to hell being paved with good intentions. And many such causes that we champion from the outside also are subject to these rules. That is something we need to keep in mind. And I will leave it there.
Yeah. The other thing I want to check, one thing which also comes out in frequent discussions about the external sector, which is the external sector, the fire in the external sector, the rupee depreciation, rising import costs, and even as that happens, Fed aggressively hiking interest rates. So what is your assessment on, say, FII behavior in the coming months as US continues to hike rates, which it seems to suggest, and on the current account deficit for the country?
No, I think it is one area that we need to be very watchful about, and if risk aversion persists for much longer, it will definitely affect cross-border capital movement, capital flows. And as a country that runs a current account deficit, naturally we look for external capital. And yes, FDI and FII flows are two components, but there are other components as well. Bilateral credit, commercial borrowings, those also meet our current account funding requirements. As of now, of course, we feel that it is something that we need to be watchful about, but not necessarily something to lose sleep over, because we do have at the moment the the kind of reserves cover that do take care of 8 to 9 months of imports. And so all I would say is it all depends on how commodity prices evolve. In the last 2-3 months, they have dropped quite materially, but in the last 2 days, oil prices have firmed up a little bit. But these things, we have to be very watchful about this. But luckily, in good times, we have built up the safety net, or we have bought the umbrellas that we can use in these times.
I think one more question on just, I think we'll talk more about foreign factors, and then we've got to open the floor to the audience. But, the way that we sort of look at where we've approached now, of course there's COVID and there's war, but a big part of it seems to be, now looking back, that there was this excessive just printing of notes that was happening from the Western economies. And to some degree now, I think the world is kind of struggling with the impact of that, process. The last 50 years of that kind of happening. Would you agree? Would you accept that a big cause of where we are right now is just this excessive kind of note printing, whether it is America or whether it's other sort of European economies?
Yeah, I mean, I would say so. Yes, I would say the answer is yes. In fact, you may accuse me of using this platform to promote my book, but I would mention it. In 2019, November, a book called The Rise, I co-authored a book called The Rise of Finance, Causes, Consequences, and Cure. So obviously, that tells you that some aspects of the way West policy evolved in the West post-2008, or even dating back to 2001 recession, etc., have evolved in a manner that for every solution, throwing more money or lower interest rates became the only answers. Yeah. And that only got bigger and bigger, that response. And in 2020, post-pandemic, yes, of course, there was a joint stimulus, both fiscal support and monetary policy support, and they were kind of open-ended. And now we are kind of facing the consequence of having to pull them back. And it is difficult to pull it back without causing pain along the way. So to a large extent, viewing every economic slowdown as a case of deficient demand, therefore requiring a textbook monetary policy or fiscal stimulus in the last 20 years, is one of the reasons why we are facing such extreme uncertainty and the prospect of dislocation in the global economy.
So if we accept that, then, I mean, do you see then that there actually being sort of a thought process of being able to bypass the dollar? Is that something that can actually realistically happen? Or is that process have started, at least the thought process started to say, can we trade directly with Russia? Can we trade directly with, the UAE without having to necessarily go through the dollar?
No, I mean, the problem is that there aren't too many other alternatives or countries which did differently. Everybody followed the same playbook. Okay. So the dollar still remains an important vehicle for financial market or trade transactions, etc. But yes, there are countries, not just India, but even many other countries, given the fact that foreign exchange reserves themselves have become subject to sanctions, have become instruments of international power relations, then it naturally encourages many countries to look at barter arrangements or trade in settlement other than dollars, etc. So that process is a natural reaction to the weaponization of currencies or foreign exchange reserves, etc. But these are still very early days to talk about that. But the overall confidence in the dollar hasn't really diminished.
Would you encourage more thought process going into these alternate sort of ways of trade?
Yes, the answer is yes. I think we need to, because in any case, as we grow in size and we have just become the world's 5th largest economy, etc., and we should be growing further along those lines, then I think it is a logical step to look at ways to internationalize the Indian rupee, and it will happen. It's a logical evolution.
And do you see, I mean, you're obviously saying that the confidence of the dollar is a global one and that's not reducing. There has been a lot of talk of the past couple of months where there is saying that the dollar hegemony over the global economy is going to reduce. So the process has started. How long it takes, we don't know. But there is enough written about this to suggest that. Is there a way that we, I mean, I'm just asking the question again, but is there a way that you can kind of trade without the dollar? I mean, of course you have confidence in the dollar, you can save in the dollar, but can we, what will come in the way of us, suppose, importing from Japan by just
I think
dealing
it's,
currency to currency
obviously, both countries have to agree. And second, if you are trading with other countries where, let's say, you have a trade surplus, and then in which case, suppose you agree to settle in your respective currencies, then you will have more of the other country's currency, then you should be able to invest it in those currencies, right? So then those countries must have capital account convertibility, which means they should allow non-residents to invest in those currencies. So if India receives more of country A's currency, but can't do much with it.
With the currency.
Either, obviously, the only country where you can use this is more like this other country from where you receive those currencies. And if they don't allow investments to happen, then what do you do with that currency? So those are all the questions that need to be sorted out. So that's why I said it's going to be a slow process. But naturally, conversations are begun because people are realizing, not only the issue of weaponization of currencies or reserves, that's not the only reason that is causing this conversation to happen. Yeah. It's also a case that whenever the United States, raises interest rates, then there is this global dollar shortage that emerges.
People are looking for other options.
Because people have been so in good times, countries, both state and non-state players, borrow in dollars, and much of the commodity trade in the world is denominated in dollars, so the need for dollars is always going to be there. And then when the United States pulls back its balance sheet, the central bank's balance sheet, or raises interest rates, the resulting dollar shortage in the world causes so much of financial vulnerability or trade dislocation. So those are also the other reasons that are prompting countries to think about, can we settle trades other than in the dollars? So it's not just the sanctions that are coming in, that are causing this discussion to happen, but also the episodes of dollar shortage, as in 2008 or now, that are making people think about this as a practical necessity.
Right.
Anant, one of the things which has happened of late and is quite remarkable is how China has emerged over the last, say, 20 years to what it is today. We saw a remarkably fast-growing China becoming the factory for the world, economies of scale, in fact, even contributing to lower inflation levels across the world. But now its role has shrunk considerably. How do you see a kind of turmoil for a long time because of China's much lower play in the global markets? And also whether it was also an engine for globalization. So do you see countries looking more inwards, turning protectionist now with a shrunk Chinese role?
There are two parts to your question. Whether China's shrinking role in global trade, would it be a cause of turmoil? I'm not sure I would use the word turmoil, but definitely there is going to be a need for a lot of adjustment, because it was the manufacturing center for the world, for many countries, for many goods. And I agree with you that it was one of the big contributors to lower inflation globally because of China's cheap labor and high productivity, both combined. So being the factory of the world, so to speak. So that is changing. That is changing because as China becomes a middle-income country, its wages rise and productivity slows down, and therefore it cannot be supplying goods at the same lower prices that it used to. That's one factor. And also the pandemic, even without going into the geopolitical tensions or trade disputes, but the pandemic itself and the lockdowns made people realize that you can't always have just-in-time production, but you also need to think about just-in-case production, and therefore you need to have certain slack built into it. So if you're running everything on very lean inventory, depending on global supply chains to feed you, then you realize that there are times that could arise. It could be a tail risk, but it did become a reality that you will be left with no supplies of inputs. And therefore, certain amount of resilience and slack have come into the business decisions, and that would naturally mean higher costs, because if you're building in a margin of safety, that is going to mean higher costs and therefore higher prices. But these are all things that will play out in the next 10, 20 years.
Yeah.
And China's loss is whose gain?
But it is not yet the case that China has lost, because if you look at the trade data, China is still running a trade surplus. So, but I think you can see that countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and even developed countries, some of them are getting their own people to reshore back to their own countries. It is not just that other developing countries benefit. It is also the case, for example, Apple has decided to relocate many of its iPhone production, the Beats and the Pods production to India, etc. So beneficiaries will be diverse. And it is just a process that has started. So it is still early days.
Okay. Wonderful. I think let's get to the audience and see if a show of hands, if we have questions. Please introduce yourself and please ask questions. Mr. Dalmia here first.
There's still some items that are, some critical items that are outside the GST net. So, for example, there's petroleum, there's liquor, and liquor creates big obstacles because every state has different rules. It's not a common market for liquor. It's a big contributor to the parallel economy. So, for critical items such as liquor and petroleum, is it the goal or the aim to eventually bring them into the GST net? Second quick question is, we're a big importer of some agricultural commodities. So, for example, edible oils, pulses depending on how much production there is every year, but it varies. And over the last few years, we've been increasing protection rates for these items. Wouldn't it help inflationary pressures to begin to bring them down again?
On the desirability of including fuel products in GST, that is, I agree with you, and I think government is also aware of that. But it is a decision that has to be taken by the GST Council, which is not just the union government's prerogative, it's also a consensus-based body. So I cannot speak about the timing as to when it will happen, although there is awareness of the importance, because it does feed into other input costs, and therefore the entire production process will benefit if these base inputs are in the GST net. It is not that we are actually raising import duties on edible oils. In fact, we have lowered them lately on some of the crude palm oil, etc., so that it will reduce the input cost. So we are also trying to address the inverted duty structure on some of them. So it is not that we are raising duties. We are raising duties on maybe the finished aspect of it, finished products, but at the crude level, we have also lowered them. So it's a dynamic process. And it is a combination of both making sure that the input costs are lower, giving some incentive for domestic production, at the same time ensuring that imported goods do not become more expensive. So we are adopting a mix of policies.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, it begins with Anand's question, who referred to the RSS chief's recent remarks on growing economic inequalities. And it's quite interesting to find that the data that he's quoting is actually from a Piketty study from 1980 onwards, where there has been an extreme growth of inequality of bottom 50% depending on 13% of national income and top 10% getting 57%. So you think the present regime's economic policy is pushing one to extreme growing economic inequalities. This, I think, has something to do with India steadily dropping, international agency dropping us on the democracy index. Recent reports have dropped us in terms of human rights index. And my associated question would be that the response of the current government has been more on the cultural front. If you have looked at the Ministry of External Affairs recent report, it said that Indian democracy, the Indian way, that we have had a very ancient culture of Indian democracy. So as an economist, do you think one can have a cultural framing of questions related to development?
That would take a separate Adda or a discussion, so I wouldn't venture there. On the inequality, see, all I would say is there is absolute and there is relative. So if absolute incomes are rising, but relative incomes are widening, yes, you can have rising inequality even when absolute incomes are rising. And for a developing country, I would focus on the rise in absolute incomes. And there, I think, last decade, we had the situation when the financial system was undergoing stress. And the corporate sector was also repairing its balance sheet. Therefore, the kind of capital formation and therefore employment generation that would have followed in its wake did not happen, because we spent the bulk of the last decade with the financial system, both banking and non-banking, in a state of stress and repairing its balance sheet. And by the time that task got largely completed, the pandemic happened, and then followed by the conflict, and now followed by tightening interest rates, etc. So the income growth process got disrupted in the second decade because of certain excessive lending and borrowing that happened in the first decade, and therefore second decade had lower growth in real incomes. And that is one of the reasons why this talk about inequality widening has cropped up. The problem with that, with inequality discussions, is that people do not take into account what is the level of inequality pre and post transfers and taxes. Even in the United States, if you measure the inequality pre-taxes and transfers, it looks much more flagrant than it looks after taxes and transfers. And that data is available only with a lag. So in probably, I haven't checked, but 2019 data would have been published by the Congressional Budget Office in the United States for just this month or last month. And then if you take a look at it, you will see that the government transfers and taxes do play their job, which is to bridge the inequality. And for developing countries, that kind of data is difficult to assemble, but you should see, therefore, what is the inequality level after you take into consideration transfers and taxes. And therefore, looking at these statements at the headline level is not the right way to think about these issues.
So, lady in the third row there. Yeah, please go ahead. Put the mic second after that.
Yeah, I'm Kirit Parik. I have a question that, much of the inflation is due to oil price increase in the international market and the domestic food price. In such a situation where you cannot increase the supply in the short run, what is the purpose of raising interest rate? It only reduces our growth rate without having much of a dent on inflation. Any comments on this?
So one reason why interest rates do go up, even though, as you said, inflation has been caused by internationally determined commodity prices, and it is not a situation of excessive demand growth which requires an interest rate response. That is the sort of the basis of your question. But as the RBI has been consistently arguing, they do not raise interest rates in response to the first round of inflation shock, which is, as you put it, comes from international prices of commodities, but they do see whether it is spilling over into second round effects across all commodities, then they respond. That is one. And the second reason is, when United States is raising interest rates and the dollar is strengthening, you should also keep in mind the fact that if you do not raise interest rates to sort of keep pace with to keep the interest rate differential from widening too much, then the impact on your currency would be far worse, and that would also bring in its wake the inflation shock via higher import prices. And the third reason is, when banks start to lend more, and we are seeing that in the credit growth data in the last 12 months, it has been picking up, you do need deposit rates to rise in tandem. Otherwise, there will be a problem of not being able to find the right amount of resources to lend out. So for these reasons, normalization of interest rates is both necessary and desirable.
But I think another follow-up on that is just actually we've not discussed energy at all.
Sorry?
We haven't discussed energy much at all, in this conversation. So, do you think we're doing all that we can to kind of, move towards some more independence in the energy space? Now, at one point we were exporting coal. Now we're still. It's reduced, but we still are importing coal. And difference is that when we were exporting, the dollar was at I think $40. Now it's at 82 rupees. So, your views on just talk a bit about energy and what we can do.
We are trying to diversify our sources of crude. That is one way of reducing our dependence on one single source. And second, we are increasing the ratio of non-fossil fuels in our energy mix. And we are also working on, if you look at the energy intensity of India's GDP, it has been declining. So energy efficiency is part of the equation. These are all the answers that come to my mind as to the steps we are taking to basically move away from this excessive dependence on imported fossil fuels. And these are happening. And I think, and also much research is going on into hydrogen as a source of energy. And we are also talking, Prime Minister also recently spoke about the need for mini nuclear plants to improve increase the share of nuclear energy in our overall energy mix, etc. So these are all the multiple ways in which over time we can sort of lower the dependence on imported fossil fuels.
Right. Is there a question there? Yeah, please. Yes.
Good evening, sir. So my question is...
Introduce yourself in a short question, please.
I'm Leher Sethi. And my question pertains to you having mentioned, you brought up the topic of, you spoke about the Right to Information Act. And you said that, I just wanted you to elaborate on how that has in any way, how does that affect how the economics of the country works? Also, isn't the whole point of a democracy that we're not just an electoral democracy. I'd like to believe that we're a liberal democracy, that's a practicing democracy. Isn't the point of the government also to be answerable to the people, to the citizens who have voted for it and put it in power? So how can you say that, the Right to Information Act is in any way hindering the work that the government is doing?
No, I didn't say that it is an undesirable thing. In fact, I said it is necessary. That's what I said. It is necessary for accountability. But in many countries, the process of deliberations is not subject to the right to information, but the decisions are subject to the right to information. So to the extent that deliberations are also part of the right to information, it does impede the quality of deliberations inside the government, because that's why I said some of the well-intentioned ideas can have consequences which are unanticipated at the time of conception. That is what I meant. But it doesn't mean that in democracies government should not be accountable. Governments are accountable not just once in 5 years, but also on a regular basis. So accountability is important, and there are multiple ways to do it, and right to information is necessary. But the way the right to information works in reality, all I said was it can also lead to unintended consequences of people opting for safety of decision making rather than taking necessary risks which, with the benefit of hindsight, others might consider it as wrong or right. But at the time of the decision making, some risks have to be taken with the basis of the information that's available. But when the entire process of deliberations also becomes subject to right to information, it can lead to unintended consequences.
Ananya?
It's okay, we can take this one first. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Hello.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I'm Dr. Anantha Nageswaran, and I understand this is a conversation about the macroeconomy and various factors, but where, this entire global uncertainty crisis started was a public health emergency. So while the firefighting in terms of, whether it was oxygen issue or whether it was the issue of beds or the immediate response that governments all across the world have sort of addressed, But given that this has been the biggest or the starkest example of how public health can have such strong implications on the economy of not just India but across the world, what is it that government is thinking in terms of its long-term strategy for public health investment, which continues to be less than 1 to 2% of the GDP? So while setting up aims and setting up beds or sort of addressing the need of the hour is something that government has done, whether it's vaccination or otherwise, but what's the larger macroeconomic, how does government see investment in public health as one of the bigger macroeconomic pillars?
No, I think it's, I do not have statistics readily at my disposal but government is committed to increasing the overall share of health expenditure to 2.5% of GDP to start with. And if you look at the health infrastructure that have been created in the wake of the pandemic, the move is, and also by the way, even if India's public health expenditure as a percentage of GDP is lower than comparable countries, but again, in comparison to where we were, the share of health expenditure and the reduction in the out-of-pocket health expenditure of Indian households, that is declining, and the government share of expenditure is rising, and then the Jan Ayushman scheme is also now expanding its coverage so that secondary and tertiary care becomes available. So all these things are proceeding in the right direction, and yes, I agree with you that continual more investment in hospitals or in the availability of medical personnel or doctors or paramedics or nurses is needed. And the government is committed to increasing the public health investment, and the data are bearing it out. But it is a balancing act that we need to keep in mind between various competing considerations on the budget. But definitely, I agree with you that public health is a priority, and indeed, the government is also viewing it on the same lines. And if you look at the data, it is proceeding on the right track in terms of our share of investments and our share of coverage of health insurance, etc. It's moving in the right direction.
Question the first row, please. Yeah.
My name is Kunihiko Kawazu. I am serving at the Embassy of Japan. From the Japanese perspective, I believe that the beautiful population structure, population pyramid of India is very promising for the long-term growth of this great country, India. Having said that, my question today is not this topic. My question is related to the, I am looking forward to listening to your views on the FTA, Free Trade Agreement. Free Trade Agreement, FTAs. FTA is good for India, or FTA is bad for India? Free trade is good for India, free trade is bad for India, or somewhere in between? That is my question. And I believe that the India is now negotiating like with European Union, Australia, so that these countries are good for the free trade the partner for the free trade agreement for India. This is my understanding. And by the way, Japan, we struck a deal with India more than 10 years ago. I hope that Japan is also a good partner for the FTAs for India. But the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, India decided to withdraw from this great free trade agreement structure. So my question is, what is the criteria? What is the point where which country is good for India, which country is bad for India as an FTA partners? Thank you.
Japan, by the way, has always taken the central bank has always taken a very contrary view to the rest of the world. The Japanese central bank has always done something very different, and they're a very different
because the problem that they face is different from what the rest of the world was facing. They're facing deflation, so they didn't mind an extra bout of inflation. So that's the reason why they took a different approach. No, I mean, I can only answer conceptually as to which country India enters an FTA with is something for the Ministry of Commerce to answer. But I think conceptually, India is not averse to free trade agreements, and that is evident in the fact that we have signed 2 this year. with UAE and Australia, and we are negotiating quite a bit more, as you mentioned. And free trade agreements for a country that runs a trade deficit in general will initially be actually in the direction of increasing the imports more, because a country that runs a trade deficit naturally imports more than it exports, and therefore it will be the one that will have more duty concessions to offer. So conceptually, a country that runs a trade deficit, once it enters into a free trade agreement, it will naturally see more imports coming into the country rather than see its exports rise. Because what happens is, when the other country, which has a trade surplus with, say, for example, India, even if it reduces its duties, all that would happen is India would now enjoy zero duty access, as other countries have already been enjoying in that country. In which case, it has only leveled the playing field, and then it then becomes a matter of competitive advantage or strength that Indian products have to demonstrate to be able to increase their exports. So naturally, free trade agreements for a country with a trade deficit will only offer benefits over the long run in terms of higher exports. But what it will do is it will lower the input cost. And therefore, the devil will be in the details as to which kind of products that you are able to attract. Are you offering duty concessions on finished products or intermediate or raw materials? Those are all the details that would determine whether a free trade agreement is beneficial very immediately or in the medium run or in the long run. But conceptually, India is not against free trade agreements. Otherwise, it wouldn't have signed 2 this year, and it wouldn't be negotiating more.
Seeing few questions. I think we'll take 2 or 3 more. Can we get here, please? Dr. Rashmi.
I don't have a question. I just have a compliment to give. In fact, the question that Dr. Ananya asked, and you of course replied very well regarding the public health, because though I run a financial services company, but I'm myself a public health person. And I have to compliment the way government has really doing a lot in health insurance sector. And that is really, really going to bridge the gap between the investment that India is going to do and the penetration in the health services. And that Ayushman Bharat and how IRDA is doing is absolutely great awareness that government is participating in.
Thank you.
Short comment, then I can take a few more here. Please
No, just a quick question. This is Ranin Banerjee from PwC. We are doing a lot on the manufacturing side of it. We need to generate jobs. We have the PLI, etc. But is there any thought process on the services side of it? Means boosting the services side.
What do you mean by thought process?
Means like any plans or anything that the government is bringing up new on actually boosting the services side of the economy, because that also generates a lot of jobs. Like we have production-linked incentives, so like that on the services, on the manufacturing side of it, are we thinking of something on the services side?
No, we
Can I suggest we take 2 questions, you can answer them together? That's okay? Yeah, here please. First. Right. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Dr. Tina Sharma, National Advisory for MSME Government of India. I have one quick question. One is that how do you deal, how government is planning to deal with state governments which are not definitely, taking Ayushman Bharat, like Delhi is not taking Ayushman Bharat on board. I'm asking that, how government is planning to deal with such state governments which are not taking Ayushman Bharat in their states, which are not formulating Ayushman Bharat in their states. First question. Second is, nearly 92% is the unorganized sector. Without the census, there are many benefits which government is giving, and I applaud for that, but how do you deal without the data, and how do you plan to deal with it if you don't have data, leaving the farmer sector, some farmer sector aside? Thank you.
Okay. So I don't have any comments on how the government plans to deal with those state governments that are not part of Ayushman Bharat. I can't answer for the Ministry of Health or. And secondly, I agree with you. Yes, a census is needed. So you need data, and you need to conduct these surveys periodically. That's my response to you. I don't know if there are specific initiatives needed for a sector that anyway, and the government has been liberalizing the FDI rules with respect to, banking or insurance on different sectors. So a package such as PLI or Atmanirbhar Bharat was needed because the manufacturing share of GDP was extremely low and organically, and there had to be an extra push given. But the services sector has demonstrated resilience and impressive growth, and it has had a sort of a liberal atmosphere in terms of its ability to grow. And therefore, it didn't require a specific policy package as manufacturing required. That is the reason why you haven't seen, but yes, maybe in employment generating sectors such as tourism, etc., where that also forms part of services, much more, the potential is much more, and their availability of personnel, because it offers employment opportunities to skilled and semi-skilled people, etc. So there I think we can think of more creative elements to make their share of services grow. But the reason why manufacturing got attention was that its share of GDP was unusually low, and it had to be brought up to more reasonable levels.
I think just a quick one on center state. Would you agree that we are moving to a territory where center is taking more and more control over the state's budget, and every state is running in these crazy deficits? How much headroom do you think states or center has to kind of borrow more? What is that debt GDP? How much headroom do we have to keep kind of?
I don't think center is taking more and more control. If anything, bulk of the expenditure happens in the states. Right. So therefore, it's simply not borne out by facts. And whether the headroom for borrowing is there or not depends on state to state. And in general, the rule is that states on a normal year do not breach 3% of deficit, and though extra room was given during the pandemic years for them to borrow more. And states also have 25 or 30% of GSDP as their debt to GDP levels that they have to watch out for, debt to GSDP level that they have to watch out for. And therefore, there are, I would say in the month of May, if I'm not mistaken, the RBI in its monthly bulletin came up with a good article on the state of the state finances. And they also publish an annual report on that. There, I think we have to look into, the answer is therefore it has to be sort of a case of state-by-state analysis, which ones have more headroom and which ones don't.
On a national level, how much headroom do you think that it's safe for us that we have?
No, in general, the debt sustainability issue for India is not an issue of concern or worry, because your nominal GDP growth of around maybe 12, 13, whatever that number is, anything about, and it is about 10%. Is well above the cost of borrowing. So debt sustainability becomes a question mark only when your nominal GDP growth rate is near the cost of borrowing or below that. In our case, that is not the issue. So we should see our debt trajectory improve over the years.
Sure. And then very quickly, one is that MSME surveys. The other is also about, say, consumer expenditure survey of the NSO. Then about, periodic labor data, which also comes with a lag. As an economist sitting and kind of contributing to policy making, how much does lack of data constrain you?
No, of course, it is a constraint. Of course, the periodic labor force survey, the lag between the time for which it reports the data and the time it is released has been shrinking. So, but there is still room for improvement. And because of the pandemic, the last 2 years, surveys could not be so easily conducted. And I'm told MOSPI has launched many surveys that need to be updated. So I think the answer is yes, whether it is labor force or whether it is capital formation, both of these are the two important components of GDP, employment and investment. We need more timely data. And now, given the spread of digital technology, etc., it should be possible to conduct them with greater regularity. And I think it is on the way. That's what I hear.
And we take last two. Please go ahead, and then Mr. Reja. Yeah, go ahead. Please introduce yourself.
I represent an NBFC in the public sector. Now, I just wanted to ask you one thing: that is there a conscious decision by the government, a conscious decision of the government, to take less recourse to the EBR funding for capital formation in the public sector. I mean, just so that because some time back we had read a story on this particular thing that probably the rating agencies abroad, they were taking exception to the fact that there are lots of off-balance sheet financing of Government of India to keep the fiscal deficit in control. So probably, is there any plan of the government to take less recourse to the extra budgeted resources?
No, but
for
I think the government
formation?
has already done that in the last two budgets. Many of the internal and extra budgetary resources recourse was drastically reduced already. Whether or not credit rating agencies talked about it, the last 2-3 years we have seen the transparency of the budget given a lot of importance, and IEBR recourse has been drastically eliminated, in fact, and that is why the budget deficit in 2021 went up to 9.4% because many of them were brought onto the budget. Yeah.
Mr. Reja?
Yeah. I'm Naveen Raheja. Just thought of taking this opportunity to convey the sentiment of the real estate industry in the country. You know, real estate has been a driver, economic driver for all the countries wherever you see there's growth. Since last 40 years. In India also I've seen, you know, whenever the real estate has been in very good shape, the economy has been in very good shape. And we have seen examples like, you know, seen Dubai growing in my last 30 years, you know, from desert to a vibrant economy, you know. We've seen Singapore, we've seen, you know, real estate overall, if we see in the world, actually is a driver for all the economies. In India, being in the industry and having been heading also the associations of the industry itself, I have seen the thing which is actually affecting all this is the over-regulation. And we want, in the coming budget, every time we expect that if we can come up with something of a single window where instead of 40, 50 clearances going and taking years to take off, you know, the investment actually which goes into stagnation. And if it can turn around in 3-4 months, then it can actually draw a wheel very fast. So if this can be conveyed to the government in the coming budget, that we should have some mechanism of single window clearance mechanism instead of 30-40 clearances separately. There is one portal created by the government, and the government itself looks into it that the things are done in a time-bound manner. So that is number one. Number two, just another suggestion for the Indian economy. We are the largest demographic population bank in this part of country. Our country has more than, I think, 55, 60 crores of underemployed and unemployed people, which whether we use them as asset or as a liability. Why can't we make them partners in growth? Why can't we give them a place, plug and play, you know, place where on a condition that their projects must create import substitution at a very, very competitive level. Don't put any taxes, any regulations on them, just give them a flatted factory or a establishment where they can use their all, intelligence, their labor, their, we have these unused resource which needs to be channelized into creating as a production hub of the world, This can be done provided we just give a hand holding where people, these youngsters, after education, they do their work instead of getting employment in multinationals and growing the other economies. It's better we do that because it will help in import substitution, competitive and export competition globally. And instead of charging them all these registrations, taxes at this stage, take them as partners, and as they earn, you also get back your money, and after you can just leave it for 10 years. After 10 years, you can fix a price that I give you a factory today, and you work, and after 10 years, you have to either give me this much of percentage of return, or this much of repatriation of investment which is done by the government.
Your first point is about speed of clearances, low regulation, and time-bound single window. I mean, I took note of your points, and also anyway the pre-budget consultations will be starting soon, so please do share your specific suggestions with the right people. And then the second point, again, I can't give a response right away because it's a good, worthwhile suggestion, and I'll definitely take it back with me, and I'll share it with the relevant people. That's all I can say, but thank you for both the suggestions.
I think we'll wrap up soon. Thank you so much for your time. I can't resist one last question. You've spent some time in foreign banks. The issue of black money in India, I don't know, I'm sure you're familiar that, we have been partners with the ICIJ. We've had Panama Papers, Paradise Papers. We have, had a lot of people upset with us for publishing their names that came out in this global leak. Just, your thought, where do you see this journey? At one point it was like, almost every corporate had to, had a Swiss account, many years, in early part, licensed Raj Post. That journey of black money being stashed abroad, how much of that has changed? How much of that has still room to change?
No, honestly, I have no idea about this. So, I was mostly dealing in economic research.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nageswaran, for all your time. Really appreciate it.
May I please invite our Chief Editor, Raj Kamal Jha, here to present a memento to Mr. Nageswaran. Thank you, everyone. Before we wind up, one final round of gratitude to our partners. Express Adda was presented by Royal Ranthambore, co-presented by UPCDA, our associate partner Devans, and our hospitality partner, Le Méridien. Thank you very much. Good night.